Hi, welcome everyone. So good to have you with us today again here at Risha. Just a few words on how we run the classes. I'll send you an invitation to become a panelist so that you can show us your smiling face if you wish, and you're also able to unmute and ask questions and make comments. Just if you could stay muted when you're not speaking so we don't have background noise. You can also engage with us not only verbally, but also on the chat here on Zoom or as a comment on Facebook. Today's class is the Postmodern Piety of Rav Shagar with Rabbi Zachary Truboff. And with that, I'll just turn this to you, Rabbi Truboff.
Great, thank you so much, Evie. We are continuing with our learning on Rav Shagar. Just to kind of, again, walk us where we've been and what we're going to look at today. In our very first session, we explored Rav Shagar's response to his experiences during the Yom Kippur War and how the traumas of the war complicated faith for him, to say it, I guess, the most straightforward way. If before the war, faith was to be conceived of as light, he says after the war that his faith still has light, but it's light with darkness in it. That faith for him cannot be simple or straightforward. After experiencing the war, experiencing the deaths of his two close friends, and that experience forces him to rethink some of the things that are most important to him. In the second session, we looked at how Rav Shagar was committed to the idea that faith can't just be an illusion. Faith can't just be something we want to believe, and therefore we believe is true, right? There are many things in life, it's called motivated reasoning, that we believe them to be true because more than anything, we want them to be true. And that is an illusion or a trap that faith often falls into, because faith promises us all these good things. We want it to be true, therefore we say it's true, regardless of what reality actually tells us. And then last week's session, we started to make the turn towards how Rav Shagar understands the meaning of faith. And there's a variety of ways in which he conceives it. What we looked at last week was primarily through the lens of Brit, of covenant. That to be a person of faith is one, especially as a Jew, who recognizes the way in which they are covenantally bound to God, Torah, and the Jewish people. Right? Covenants are founded in love. We see that in the Torah. Brits come to sort of make real and permanent the experience and feelings of love that one has for another. And what it means to be a person of faith is to recognize the way in which covenant binds us to another. The way the covenant binds us to another in ways that we can't escape, no matter how hard we try, right? When you're in a covenantal relationship, even when you are distant from your covenantal partner, you still kind of feel their pull on you. And the way that covenant works is that you don't just feel bound to them, right? You feel, in a sense, compulsively bound to the other, to that which you are covenantally committed to. The way covenant works, like I said, is even when you're distant from your covenantal partner, you sort of feel the pull of them on you. And the way covenant works is that you always sort of seem to find your way back, because you need to find your way back. Because when you're in love, when you feel bound, there's nothing ultimately that you want to let stop you from getting back to the one that you love. And last week we also focused on the idea where, for Rav Shagar, part of the way covenant is made real in the relationship between God and the Jewish people is through Torah. Right? It is the Jewish experience of Torah, the Jewish engagement with Torah, that allows us to hear God's voice, that allows us to be in an active dialogue and relationship with God. It's the way that we feel bound to Torah, that we keep studying it, that we keep returning to it again and again. Every Shabbat, we come back to that Parshat HaShavua. Every time we finish a Masechet of Gemara, we say Hadran Alach, that we're going to return to it. But the experience of being bound to Torah is one in which we are perpetually returning to it once more, because we hear God calling to us from within it. And it's that sense of being bound to God through Torah that also enables us to be bound to our other Jews as well, because the covenantal relationship to Torah is not an individualistic one, at least not purely so. Right? All the Jews share this covenant with God, therefore all the Jews share this covenant with Torah. And that's why when you want to find the meaning of Torah, you can't do it just on your own. You need to do it in dialogue with others. So that was where we ended last week. And I want to pick up this week with another angle about thinking about this idea of covenant and relationship with God, and ultimately of faith. As was pointed out to me by Judy, one of the participants, Rav Shagar's language of centering Torah and Torah study for covenant is deeply masculine, in the sense that it was traditionally men who studied Torah. It was traditionally men that had a bar mitzvah. It was traditionally men that publicly read from the Torah. So by centering covenant through the idea of Torah, it can be exclusionary for people who maybe don't experience it exactly that way. I personally relate very deeply to Rav Shagar's notion of Torah as the center of covenant, because that's how I feel my Jewishness exceeding me, being bound to something beyond me that I keep coming back to. But I recognize it is certainly not the only way in which one is bound to their Jewishness, and certainly not the only way that I myself feel connected to it. So I wanted to today to sort of give us another angle, dimension of thinking about this notion of covenant. And then next week, we're going to look at how both of these ideas of covenant ultimately lead Rav Shagar to trying to understand the problem of suffering, right? Because the problem of suffering is that the problem of trauma is that it destroys meaning. It strips away meaning from our lives. And in many ways, it also strips away the relationships that we have in our lives. So the challenge is, how does covenant hold up in the face of suffering? That'll be for next week. But for this week, I wanted to, again, give us a different angle, a different dimension of thinking about the idea of covenant. And that is primarily through the metaphor of language. Rav Shagar is deeply interested in the notion of language. And one of the things that Rav Shagar recognizes, and he's one of the first, I would say, in the Orthodox world, for lack of a better expression, the traditional Torah world, to recognize that in the 20th century, philosophy, anthropology, many different disciplines in academia start taking a special interest in language. That language is the central building block of human existence. That if you want to understand human beings, and you want to understand how human beings understand the world, right, what you should look at is language. And this shift that occurs, and again, in philosophy and other disciplines, is known as the linguistic turn. It's a technical term in which all these sort of different academic disciplines started focusing on language in a very interesting fashion. And one of the major conclusions that comes out of the linguistic turn, this centering of language, is the profound impact that language has on the way that we experience the world. That the language we use, the words that we speak, profoundly shape the way that we experience things. And this becomes a very, very important point, again, in philosophy, anthropology, all sorts of disciplines. But it also has profound implications for how we think about, again, Judaism and Torah and God. What's so fascinating, which Rav Shagar recognizes, is this idea of the linguistic turn of centering language as being so important, has a lot of resonance with rabbinic thought and Jewish mystical thought, right? You're probably all familiar with the idea that when God creates the world, how does God do that? Well, if you look at classic myth, right? Classic myth preceding the Torah, right? The gods often create the world in very physical ways, right? In fact, sometimes even the world is created from the body of the gods, right? Like the world is like an emanation, and the world itself is like a manifestation of the gods in some fashion, right? It's very physical creation. But when you look at the Torah, right, God doesn't seem to create through any kind of visible physical action of any kind, right? How does God create? Well, God speaks. Right? God says, Vayihi or, let there be light, and light comes into existence. And it's fascinating because what the Torah is making clear is that creation takes place through language. And in many ways, that is the philosophical conclusion of the last century or so, that the way that the human beings experience the world, understand the world, and in a sense, create their world, it is through language. And Rav Shagar recognizes that this sort of and again, it's interesting. The Jewish dimension of this does, in some ways, influence modern philosophy. So it's hard to sometimes know the chicken and the egg here, which one is sort of like, drawing on the other. But Rav Shagar recognizes that the similarities between these two approaches, between philosophy and Judaism, in this sense about language, can be a point of profound creativity by recognizing the similarity and how each one can inform the other. So I want us to look through some of Rav Shagar's teachings on language, and we will also then think through how this relates to the idea of covenant. So Rav Shagar, in one of his essays, in the first text here, he gives us an example in a very sort of practical sense. What does it mean to say that we experience the world through language? That our experience of the world is shaped through language. And here's what he says. He says, the world in which we live is saturated with words. Meaning, like when we look out at the world, we think we experience it as images, right? That's what visual input is, imagery, right? But Rav Shagar is saying that in some ways is a bit of an illusion. That we might think we experience the world through our eyes, through the visual imagery all around us. But in truth, when we actually look at the world, what we're not seeing are just images, but words as well. So what does he mean by this? He says this refers not just to the words that surround us in writing. I mean, obviously there's words all around us in the world. You walk out, you see signs, right? There's language everywhere. But Rav Shagar is saying this doesn't just refer to the, again, writing, the internet, and different media that we experience all around us, but also in the words from which our world is composed. That our experience of the world is itself shaped through language, even when we don't see that language there. Rav Shagar continues, he says, we don't see things as they are, rather we see the words and definitions that encompass them. Meaning we look at things and what we don't realize is what we are actually seeing is words being superimposed on different objects, right? Language provides the conceptual schema through which we see the world and understand the world. And what's going to become very, very important for Rav Shagar and for many philosophers is that we can only know things through language. What do I mean by this? Well, there was a bit of a debate in philosophy to the extent whether thought/cognition precedes language or thought/cognition is a result of language. What do I mean by this? What I mean is, can we know things without language, right? Is it that like if a child was essentially raised in this world without language, would they be able to know things about the world? Or is knowledge of the world purely dependent on having language to be able to make sense of the world, right? That is a philosophical debate. Rav Shagar and the stream in which he is drawing on argues, again, with the side that says that thought depends on language, not that language follows thought. And there have been cases of children being raised without language, and clearly there can be some sense of cognition with very minimal language. But what has also been shown again and again is the fundamental relationship between language and cognition, that we need words to be able to understand things because we experience the world and process the world through the conceptual schema that language provides for us. So again, here's what Rav Shagar says. He says, when we see a chair, we say to ourselves without speaking, here is a chair. Meaning we look at the world and we see an object and know immediately what it is, because in the back of our minds, it's like I said, it's as if there is a word superimposed on that object. He says, we don't see the chair and its details, seat, leg, back. We just see the chair. Meaning when we look at an object, we don't have to like look at the collection of its parts to be able to determine what it is, right? We see it and immediately make that conclusion, that association. We see the chair in terms of its functional uses for us. We don't see the chair in itself, rather a chair that's possible to sit on and perhaps even stand on, right? We sort of see the chair for what it is because that's what language names it as such. And that is immediately then how we look at it functionally. When I call something a chair, I start to look at it as a chair. I start to ask myself, okay, where do I sit down? How is it going to feel? If I was to call that same object something else, I would experience that object in a different fashion, right? I'll give you like a sort of practical example here. when we had a house in America, which seems like a very long time ago, we live in a smallish apartment here in Yerushalayim, but we had a house in America, we had trees out front. And at a certain point, we were told that the trees were kind of decaying and they might need to be cut down. And at a certain point, I think we did cut one, we cut one of them down, or a big part of them down. And what was left with was a stump, right? And this stump is sort of, again, not very aesthetic, not very much to do with a big tree stump. It just kind of is there, and it's a bit of an eyesore. But I remember, let's look at that stump differently for a moment. As long as it's a stump, it just sort of sticks out, it's an eyesore. But if I decide to myself and say, you know what, that's no longer a stump, that's a chair. That's the chair I'm going to sit on when I want to read a book on Shabbat afternoon and relax out in my yard, right? When I stop calling that stump a stump and start calling it a chair, and that's actually how I used it, right? That naming of it actually changes how I see it and experience it, right? It's no longer that aesthetic eyesore. It's actually something that I sit on and I have a certain physical bodily relationship to. I enjoy it. I look forward to it, right? I associate it with my Shabbat afternoon reading, right? The way that we name things, and obviously, again, the way that we use things, because that often follows by how we name things, is going to fundamentally change how we experience it. Now, one other point here I want to just add here to flesh this out before we turn to how Rav Shagar understands this in a bit of a broader sense, right? Wittgenstein, who's the great philosopher of language in the early 20th century, originally from a Jewish family, but he himself was not, by his generation, the family was no longer Jewish. But Wittgenstein, just to give you a sense of this approach that we're talking about here, one of his famous lines is, "The limits of language are the limits of my world." The limits of language are the limits of my world. And what Wittgenstein is getting at with that statement is that we can't think about things unless we have the words for them. So that which exists beyond language is to a large extent not accessible to us. So the language that we have will shape our experience of the world in very specific ways. And if we don't have certain words and certain meanings associated to those words, then our experience of the world will be different, right? And this is true, at least to the extent that we know that not all languages have the same vocabulary, right? It's not like a word that exists in English always exists in every other language, right? Languages have different vocabularies, and even words in different languages that sort of mean the same thing don't necessarily exactly mean the same thing. Right, that a language presents a certain conceptual schema on its own, and to see the world through the lens of one language is not the same necessarily as seeing the world through the lens of another. I don't know if there's any people here who speak multiple languages on the call, but again, it's like been well documented that people sort of experience things and act differently in different languages, right? I know people, I don't think this is so true for me, but I know people here in Israel who will say, you know, the way I am in English is different than the way I am in Hebrew. Because again, language here is also not just the words, right? Languages encompass always a sense of culture, a sense of norms, a sense of body language, right? So when we say the language, it's a broad unit, but it's broad enough that it can shape things in a very deep way for us. One of the examples Rav Shagar used to use is he would love to point out the fact, he writes this in a few places, that in English, we have a word for like and a word for love. But in Hebrew, there's only one word for both of those things. What's that one word? It's ohev, right? Which we as English speakers know means love. And in Hebrew, there's no word for like, right? And it's cute, right? Because what it basically sort of gets at is this cultural distinction between Americans or English speakers and Israelis, right? English, we have like and love, right? Because English is a language in which we're always sort of modulating our ambivalence towards things. We have degrees of feelings towards things. I can like something, but I can also really love something. In Hebrew, there's just you love it or not, right? In Hebrew, it's much more black or white. And you can make a drush on that, right? That Hebrew is less about ambivalences. It's about, are you in or are you out? Where English is, again, about sort of always modulating your distance to certain things and always saying, how much do I care about it? Or do I really care about it? In Hebrew, it's just all in or all out. And Rav Shagar would use that as an example of showing how, like, again, language offers us certain conceptual options, and whether it has more or less of those options is going to shape the way that we experience things. And again, this gets to the very heart of the fact that to a certain extent, translation between languages is always incommensurable, right? Every translation is never a full and complete translation. It's always leaving something out, which again gets at this idea that every language creates its own world, and the type of language that we use presents certain opportunities for us to experience the world in ways that other languages may not. So as I said before, the classic mystical expression of this has to do with the creation of the world. Right? God creates the world through speech. Chazal say, "Ba'asara ma'amarot nivra olam." Right? In 10 speech acts, God created the world. In Sefer Yetzirah, which is a later rabbinic work, or rabbinic work from late antiquity, or towards the end of the late antiquity, also goes on and on about how literally God's speech creates the world, how the language, the words, the letters of God's speech actually are what imbue every aspect of creation with their existence, with their essence. And this becomes a major theme in Kabbalah and Hasidut in a very similar way to philosophy. So I want to give you, there's many examples I could bring you to show this idea in Kabbalah and Hasidut. I wanted to bring one from Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, just because we've been looking at Rabbi Nachman as a touchstone for Rav Shagar. And what's interesting about Rabbi Nachman's expression of this, the first paragraph is basically you can find in many, many Hasidic thinkers, but he adds another dimension of it that I think is very helpful for the way Rav Shagar understands things. So Rabbi Nachman of Breslov says here, source 2, he says, the creation came into existence by means of the spoken word. Right? We know this. God created through speech. The world didn't exist until God spoke. As it is written in Psalms, by the word of God, the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth, their entire host was created. And this drush on this verse, famous Hasidic drush, I believe it starts with the Maggid of Mezrich, and it is also continued very prominently in Tanya. Right? Shar Yichud Ve'emunah in Tanya is all about this drush on this verse, that literally everything in existence gains its existence from the Hebrew letters that God uttered, right? So it's like almost like you can think of it this way, that the Hebrew letters that God uttered when God created, those letters are like the molecules of creation. Every object is made up of some combination of those original divine letters that God uttered. Rabbi Nachman continues, he says, the spoken word is the demarcation of all things. God circumscribed his wisdom in the letters, such that certain letters demarcate one thing, while other letters demarcate something else, right? You take different combinations of the Hebrew alphabet, and those combinations come together to form the fundamental essence and identity of everything. And then he adds here in the last part here, 3 lines from the bottom, and this is a bit more of a chiddush on Rabbi Nachman's part. He says, for the Torah scholars create everything through their words. As it is written, and I've declared to Zion, you are my people, Ami, my people. But the drush is, do not read Ami, don't read it as my people, but Imi, with me, right? And what does that mean? Just as I make heaven and earth through my word, so you do the same, right? The drush is here that not only does God create through speech, but that human beings, and particularly Torah scholars, create the world through speech. So we have to understand, what does that mean? What does it mean that Torah scholars, what does it mean that Jews create the world through speech? So there's certainly mystical dimensions of this, but for Rav Shagar, right, the answer is in a certain sense much more basic, right? That if we take, again, this basic philosophy of language approach, that the language that we use, the words that we use, shapes our experience of the world. And the ways that Jews experience the world as Jewish is through the language that we use, the language of Torah, right? Torah is a language in a sense, right? The words of the written Torah, the words of the oral Torah, right? That's what Hebrew comes from. That's what Hebrew makes up, right? In a large sense, right? When we think about what does it mean to be a Jew, it means to be able to speak a language of Jewishness. And I'll drive the point home even a little bit more, though Rabbi Nachman doesn't say this I think it's important to understand. Judaism sees a direct connection between language and holiness. And what do I mean by this? Normally, we tend to assume language is referential. And what that means is that we tend to think about it in the following sense, that we have a word, and that what corresponds with that word is like a picture of something, right? So if I say the word dog, right, we're going to all have in mind this image of a dog. If I say the word, computer, if I say the word Rav Shagar, right, like we have images that pop into our mind. That is the way we often think about language. And there's some truth to that. But the radical part about Judaism is that we can't use images to think of God, right? That's the whole point of the second commandment, right? God has no image that we can know, and we can't make any image of God. What that means is if we can't know God through images, then the only way we can know God is through language, right? Language, what makes language different from images is that language can point to things that you don't see, right? That's the whole thing that makes language special. You can say the word and the thing doesn't have to actually be there. The thing doesn't have to actually exist at all. With images, it always assumes a certain presence of some kind, right? There's the image, I can point at it. But with God, there is no image, nothing you can ever point to, right? At most, you can hear God call and you can talk to God. You can call God's name. But the only way we can have any kind of relationship with God is through language. So in a certain sense, right, when we say language shapes our experience of the world as Jews, we're also saying that the whole notion of holiness is fundamentally dependent on language. Because if holiness comes from God, the only way to know God or access God or bring God into this world in any way is through language. So for Jews, there's no other choice. We need language to make our world. So that's the only way we can begin to have a relationship with the divine. Now, what we're talking about the language of Torah, the way for Rav Shagar, one of the primary ways that creates this Jewish experience of the world is through halacha. I mean, I want to use halacha as an example, even though the language of Torah is broader than halacha, simply because for somebody who lives within halacha, right, the words of halacha are constantly on their lips. Like the words of halacha create a normative system of rules and regulations that you're constantly thinking about referring back to, right? So it's like always present, right? And halacha isn't just about rules. Halacha also defines objects, right? Halacha gives names to everything. And when I say halacha here, I mean like the Torah in a broad sense. That's what it is, right? So Rav Shagar says here, this is source 3, the halacha not only internalizes the surrounding reality, meaning the halacha doesn't just take into consideration everything around us, but it also influences the way in which we experience reality in a manner that is similar to the midrashic idea that God looked into the Torah and created the world, right? The Midrash Rabbah says, Mistakel b'oraita the bara alma, right? That God looks into Torah and creates the world. And to a certain extent, that's what the Jew does with the language of Torah, the language of halacha, that we like look into Torah, we say the words, and that is what, creates the world around us. Now, this idea, again, it might sound a little fantastical, but Rav Shagar takes it very seriously, and I think we should take it very seriously as well, if only, as I said, because language is the only way that we can, in a certain sense, create holiness, invoke holiness, make an experience of holiness possible. Rav Shagar gives this really interesting example, which I like. I don't know if everybody else will be drawn to it as much, but it shows in which the power of language, the power of names that we use on objects just totally changes our relationship to them. So here is the story that he tells. He says, I used to live close to the bakery in Jerusalem's Beit Yisrael neighborhood. On Fridays, I would buy challah there for Shabbat. Now, if I don't know if any of you have lived in Jerusalem before, but going to the bakery on Friday here to buy challah for Shabbat, freshly baked challah, is like an experience. It's just like it's part of your week, but it's also like part of like what you do to help get ready for Shabbat. Like I am the member of my family charged with getting challah for Shabbat, and I feel like if I don't get that challah, if I don't walk into the bakery like crammed with people with the smell of fresh bread, then like something is missing in my own experience of getting ready for Shabbat. So this very act itself is not just like going in the store to get some milk. Like there's a significance to going to the store on Friday, to the bakery on Friday to get challah. And I have the honor of living across the street from no less than 3 bakeries. which all have great challah options. Again, it's something special to be there on Fridays. But here's what happened. Rav Shagar was in the bakery on one Friday, and he says, I once witnessed a man exit the bakery with challah, which he proceeded to tear apart and devour. Right, so what he sees is this guy buy a challah on Friday, walk out of the bakery, and immediately start, tearing into it, biting into it. And Rav Shagar says, I was shocked. Right, that very same holy Shabbat challah that we would cover during Kiddush to spare at the humiliation of knowing it was not the first to be blessed was being raped. Right, and I know that's a very strong language, but what Rav Shagar is saying is this holy special challah that you buy on Fridays just to have on Shabbat. Right, like it's holy, like it's special. That's what challah is, right? And that means it should be safe for Shabbat and eaten properly. Most importantly, that means if it's holy, you should say a bracha before you eat it. You should wash your hands before you eat it, because that's what challah is. It should be treated as kodesh in that way. And Rav Shagar is saying to see somebody else treat challah bread in a very secular, mundane fashion was shocking for him. It was like the challah was being violated. He says, to me, the challah is not merely a loaf of bread. Its context turns it into something entirely different. A Shabbat challah, one whose very flavor differs from that of commonplace bread. Right? This isn't just bread. Right? This is challah. This is part of the holiness of Shabbat. And once you call it challah, right, it just takes on a totally different essence, and therefore our relationship to it is totally different. Now, what's fascinating in this example, I'll just point out, there's nothing halachic about challah bread, right? In the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah says that you should make enough bread on Shabbat that you have to take challah from it, right? If you make above a certain amount of dough, you have to separate some of it out as a tithe. That's all the Ramah says. You don't have to do that on Shabbat, it's a custom. This idea that challah bread is like a requirement on Shabbat obviously isn't true. You can have any kind of bread on Shabbat and that would be sufficient. The idea that we have this challah bread is a custom, it's a Jewish custom. But what this gets at is the way that the language of Judaism, the language of Torah, isn't even about just sort of the black and white of halacha. Right? Halacha is maybe like the foundation of it, the skeleton of it. But at the same time, Jews add to the language of Torah through customs, through practices, through all sorts of countless ways. And even something that is just a pure minhag, right? It doesn't matter. Once Jews have that language, that words of holiness, they attach to it, it's as if the thing becomes holy. That becomes our experience of it. And I want to just give a personal example of this, of the way that sort of language enables us to access holiness and actually shapes our world in this way. And this is my own experience. There was a stretch when my wife was having a very difficult, problematic pregnancy. And we had to spend more than one Shabbat in the hospital. And if you've ever had to spend a Shabbat in the hospital before, it's really the last place in the world you want to be on Shabbat. And the reason for that is because the day-to-day rhythms of religious life always depend on having some sort of control over your environment, especially on Shabbat. You need things set up in a certain way on Shabbat to make it Shabbat. But the problem is when you're in a hospital room, right, you have no control over anything, right? There's again, machines making noise, nurses coming in and out, procedures that need to be done, the lights are on, you have no control. And a hospital room on Shabbat is maybe the one place in the world that feels least like Shabbat, right? You can't really pray that properly. You're not, if you're a woman especially, you're not able to be tsanua, you're not able to cover yourself maybe fully in the way that you want. And what happens is that a hospital room on Shabbat can be basically the place that is completely devoid of any and all connection to God. Nevertheless, one of the things that my wife and I experienced in these hospital rooms on Shabbat were the moments when the language of halacha, the language of Torah, was able to create a sense of holiness, right? One of the fascinating things about Shabbat is what's the way we bring in Shabbat, right? The actual mitzvah that to a certain extent brings in Shabbat, sanctifies Shabbat, is Kiddush, right? Literally means sanctification. And the essence of Kiddush is not the wine that we drink, right? That's sort of a way that we make it more special. But the essence of Kiddush are the words that we recite, right? The words that we recite are what usher in the holiness of Shabbat. And when we were in these hospital rooms, they were not hotel rooms. My wife and I, oftentimes we were able to maybe cobble together some kind of minimal Shabbat experience, some grape juice, a little bit of food that people were able to bring us, a roll, or something like that. But in the midst of even all of that difficulty, we were able to say Kiddush, we were able to say the words of Kiddush, and suddenly it felt like it was really Shabbat. That little crappy roll that we were eating suddenly became challah. It was something else entirely. And that was all created through, again, the language that we were bringing to that situation. In a place that felt, completely absence of God, is the language of halacha, the language of Torah, the language of being Jewish that helped, bring about and connect to a sense of something more. And just to give you, one final example of this, Rav Shagar, again, one of his essays, he says that the Torah is a collection of signifiers. Signifier is a technical term from famous structural linguist de Saussure, who differentiates between the signifier and the signified. Signifier is what we might call the phoneme. It's like the word as spoken, and the signified is the meaning of the word. So like the way it's often shown is that like this, if I say dog, that's the signified, just the sound of the word dog. So that's the signifier. The signified would be like the image of a dog, right? So our world is full of signifiers, of all these words that we use. And the Torah is a collection of signifiers, right? There's so many Jewish words that we use that essentially emerge from the Torah, from the Jewish people. And it's the collection of all these signifiers together that grant us our experience of meaning in the world. And Rav Shagar says, through all these signifiers, the Torah builds a world and grants a home. Meaning it's the fact that the Jewish world is full of all these words, all of these signifiers, that makes it feel like a home to us, that makes it feel like a Jewish world to us, right? The words of the Torah that make up the language of halacha, the language of the Jewish people, fill our social world. They fill our experience of the world, giving it shape and structure. Terms like Beit Knesset, Shabbat, and Tefillah, those words orient our lives in so many ways. Around a series of places, times, and practices that we return to again and again and again, enabling our lives to feel both stable and predictable. Right? We use these words create a certain structure to reality for us and structure our experiences in particular ways. Right? And again, the language they use has a profound effect on everything. And again, I think this is really fascinating because one of the things that when I used to work with converts, let's say, when people were learning to become Jewish, right? One of the things I always felt very strongly that if they're going to become a Jew, if they're going to experience Judaism seriously, then language is just so essential to that. It was always critical. A convert at the very least has to be able to read Hebrew. But more importantly, I would encourage them to use Jewish words, right? Because again, it's the use of these Jewish words that kind of fill our world with a certain set of meanings and experiences. Now, the fact is that if language is so important to us, then we have to ask ourselves, or at least be aware of the fact that Jews often don't just speak Hebrew, right? In fact, for most of the last 2,000 years, Jews didn't really engage Hebrew as a spoken language, right? Our experience to Hebrew was that it was Lashon HaKodesh, right? It was a language of holiness, but therefore that's not the language we would use in our day-to-day experience of things, even though we would still invoke, Hebrew words quite often. And one of the things that Rav Shagar points out is that many of the fights about Jewish identity and the fights about assimilation often begin and end with the question of language, question of what language are Jews going to use. And you can see this actually going back to the times of the Second Temple, in which the primary, antagonist to Jewish existence was Greek/Hellenistic culture. And there's a very interesting text in Masechet Sofrim, a rabbinic text, that really gets at when you lose language, you lose Jewishness, right? If there's a way to hold on to one sense of Jewishness, one sense of, again, connection to God, Torah, and the Jewish people, language is essential for that. And what this text in Masechet Sofrim describes is the writing of the Septuagint, right? The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Bible, and the rabbis did not look at the Septuagint as such a wonderful thing. So why is it they didn't like the idea of the Torah being translated into Greek? Couldn't it be a good thing that now, Jews who didn't speak Hebrew, they could actually understand the Torah? I mean, you have to keep in mind, even in the Second Temple period, right, there were a lot of Jews who didn't know Hebrew. So, and only knew Greek. Philo of Alexandria, right, famous Jewish Hellenistic philosopher, most scholars think he didn't really know Hebrew. right? To the extent that Philo is going to know anything about the Torah, and he did learn a lot about the Torah, it's through the Septuagint, it's through the Greek translation of the Torah. So you could say it's a good thing, it gets out Torah to a larger audience. But that's not the way the rabbis understood it. What Rav Shagar, and this is a text that Rav Shagar cites, it says it once happened that 5 elders wrote the Torah for King Ptolemy. King Ptolemy in Greek King Ptolemy is the one who had the Torah translated into Greek. And that day was as ominous for Israel as the day on which the golden calf was made. The day the Torah was translated into Greek was a day as terrible as the Egel Zahav was made by the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, since the Torah could not be accurately translated. Remember I said before, languages are always to a certain extent incommensurate with each other. So the problem with translation is that you always lose something. And that's a problem when it comes to the Torah, because maybe you're losing too much. And the Masechet Sofrim and the Gemara actually go on to show all these mistranslations that took place by when the Torah was translated into Greek, and why that was all these misconceptions that occurred that were problematic. But for our purposes, I want to just focus on the idea that when the Torah was translated into Greek, right, it was a day as terrible as the making of the golden calf, right? Which sounds kind of extreme. But we have to understand that the rabbis are pointing to the golden calf for a reason, right? Because if you can think back to the Torah, right, the golden calf was made while the Jewish people were still at Mount Sinai. And what's so shocking about the golden calf, not just that they made an idol, but that they made an idol at the same place where they had made a covenant with God. They made an idol and started worshiping an idol at the same place God had revealed God's self to the Jewish people, and the Jewish people had said, we're going to be with you, God, forever. So what's significant is that for the rabbis, the golden calf is a symbol of the Jewish people betraying the covenant. And that's the idea that Masechet Sofrim is getting at here, that when you lose Jewish language, right, you lose your connection to the covenant. And Rav Shagar goes on to describe this in the next text here. He's building on this Masechet Sofrim text, using the ideas of Wittgenstein. Ludwig Wittgenstein, again, the great philosopher of language, early 20th century. And Rav Shagar asks, why was the use of Greek language so dangerous? Come on, we say, like, Chazal, rabbis, what's going on here? It was bad, maybe, but it couldn't have been as bad as the golden calf. And Rav Shagar says, it is a problem of communication. Language is not a collection of signs, rather is the foundation of being at home. But language is always inextricably bound up with identity. That's why, nations, classically, when nationalism emerges in the 19th century, land, language, and culture, those are the components of national identity, right? Your identity is always bound up with the language that you speak. So that's like first and foremost, language and identity. That's why language, it says here, is the foundation of being at home, right? Because the language that you speak, it establishes your sense of self. He continues, he says, it is what enables a home community. And this is what's significant that Rav Shagar highlights here. Language isn't something that you just speak by yourself. Language is something that you always speak with others. By speaking the language, you inextricably are also bound to others, because you got to speak the language with somebody else. He says the Torah receives its meaning from the fact it resides in both the community and the home. Language is something that we feel we have control over because we know the words, we say the words, but language always exists beyond us because other people speak it as well. He says, in the same manner, Wittgenstein taught us there can never be a private language. And one of Wittgenstein's points, major points, is that you can't make a language that's all your own. That language only has meaning in the context of speaking it with others. So even if you think that like you can go like live by yourself and do your own thing, right? You can't escape the fact that you bring language with you. Or if you were to make up your own language, it would be a language that is being derived from other languages. You can't make it up from scratch. You can't do it on your own. Right? There's a fundamental proof why human beings are not, Robinson Crusoes who are basically born, islands into themselves. Human beings are always born already enmeshed in relations with others. And that's primarily because language forces us to be in relation with others. He says, again, there could be no private language, no private halacha. Halacha are the language, the words, the rules, the norms that bind us and connect us to other Jews. as an essential part of living a halachic life is rootedness in a broader, comprehensive framework, and this is not possible for a person to do alone. Language always connects you to others. Language isn't just about the words you speak. As I said before, language is about the behaviors, the body language, but it's a whole host of things that become tied together with it. And then he says at the end here, covenant is what makes the meaning of language possible. What does it mean? Covenant is what makes the meaning of language possible. So what Shagar is getting at here is that it is the fact that we have this intimate relationship to language, that we feel like it's like part of us and we are part of it, that enables it to be so meaningful to us, that enables it to be a source of meaning for us. In fact, this idea about the intimacy, our intimate connection with language, and again, it may sound sort of silly, but I think Chazal were onto something when they said that the changing from Hebrew to Greek, it was like the betrayal of the covenant. So I found this great article a year or two ago in which the title is "Why Learning a New Language is Like an Illicit Love Affair." Right? Why learning a new language is like an illicit love affair. Because what the article gets at is exactly what Rav Shagar and these texts are getting at. That a relationship with language is an intimate one. We're bound to it. It provides, again, a source of meaning. For those of you that are like poets or writers, there can almost be like an erotic dimension to language. Like how do we, the way that we can play with its meaning and like feel like we're discovering and creating new things. And again, like there's something very powerful about it. I'll read you just a quick quote from this article. It says, "The truth is that entering an intimate relationship with a new language often colors everything. Our eyes expect the new words. Our ears habituate to the new sounds. Our pens memorize the new letters. While the infatuation takes over our senses, the language's anatomy etches into our brains." And that's the last part there is, I think, the most powerful part, right? Again, the language's anatomy etches itself into our brains. There's something about language that like gets deeply, deeply, deeply inside of us, to the point where, as I said last time with covenants, right? To be in a covenantal relationship with another is to feel that you don't know where you end and the other begins because you're bound to them, right? You're so bound to them, it's as if they are a part of you. Well, that's exactly what our relationship to language is. And for Jews, to be a Jew means to have this Jewish language, this written Torah, this oral Torah, right? The customs, the practices, right? The Jewish words that we use, right? That is what comes as if it's like deeply embedded in us, but also obviously beyond us, right? The very idea of the Torah comes from our Sinai. Again, it's both within us and beyond us, and we are bound to it. And again, just to even point out the covenantal dimension of it, Moshe famously tells the Jewish people in Devarim that God didn't just speak to Moshe at Har Sinai. Moshe actually says God spoke to the Jewish people face to face, right? To be in that covenant, to be bound to the other, is to be in that face-to-face relationship to them. And what Rav Shagar notes here, just to bring it to a head with again, how we understand the Hanukkah, he cites Rav Tzadok, who says that the Maccabees' defeat of the Greeks during the Second Temple, again, the threat of the Greeks was the Greek language, was through the innovation and spread of the oral Torah. It was the affirmation of the oral Torah, the spoken language of Torah, that is what secured Jewishness, affirmed Jewishness. And again, even if Hebrew is not the spoken language of the Jewish people, the language of Torah, the language of Jewish language writ large, becomes the language that structures our world. Even Jewish languages that aren't Hebrew, Ladino, Yiddish, right? These are Jewish languages, right? In the sense that for some people, Yiddish is more Jewish than Hebrew, even for Hasidim, right? If you talk, I know certain Hasidim who will say that like Yiddish has a holiness that even Hebrew doesn't have for them. And that can sound strange, but it shows the way that language is expansive. No single person controls language. It's something that everybody contributes to, and is always beyond us in some fashion. Now, how does this get us back to the idea of faith and language and covenants, and how does this all get tied together? So with the time we have remaining, I want to try to unpack this briefly. So you're probably all familiar with a famous Gemara, a Gemara that's relevant because Purim is coming up, right? The Gemara Masechet Shabbos about the idea that at Har Sinai, God held the mountain over the Jewish people's heads and threatened them and said, either accept the Torah or be buried underneath the mountain. And what the Gemara here points out is that if the Jewish people accepted the Torah under duress, under coercion, then the Jewish people are going to have a good excuse when God wants to punish them for their sins later on. Because what the Jewish people can say is, well, we didn't really enter into this willingly, right? You forced us into this. So how can you hold us accountable for the fact that you forced us into this, covenant? Right? It's funny. The Gemara thinks this is like a great answer. The Jewish people got God, right? You could also imagine every child telling their parent the same thing. Like, I didn't want to go to that school. I didn't want to be Jewish. I didn't want to be religious. I don't have to keep these rules. You're forcing it on me. If I don't want to do it, why should I be held responsible? To the public, that doesn't sound very convincing, right? Because that's just not the way the world works. So it's interesting that Chazal somehow think it's a convincing answer. But what the Gemara ultimately comes to is the conclusion that even if the Jews were coerced into accepting the Torah at Har Sinai, they eventually came to accept the Torah in the time of Achashverosh, right? The holiday of Purim is the manifestation of the Jewish willingness to accept the Torah, right? And what's important, the way the Gemara is typically understood is that we accepted it only under duress at Har Sinai, but on Purim, God is like basically absent. So that's the moment when we make our free will choice, right? This is the way the Gemara is typically understood. At Sinai, we were forced. On Purim, we chose. It was a free act. God wasn't around, so we said, no, even though God's not here, we're going to accept the Torah. We want it for ourselves. It's our free choice. Now, Rav Shagar notes that it's like not really that simple, maybe. And he bases this on the Maharal, but the very fact that maybe the only reason the Jewish people could accept the Torah on Purim was because it was coerced upon them at Har Sinai. What do I mean by this? So Rav Shagar writes in his essays on Purim, he says, God compelled Israel to accept the Torah because only through such compulsion could their acceptance take on a level of essential necessity not given to any renunciation. The compulsion spoken of here needs to be understood not as mere external duress, but rather in the psychological sense of inner necessity. The Jew is bound up to his Jewishness in a compulsive fashion and cannot escape it. So what is going on here? What is Rav Shagar trying to get at? Rav Shagar is trying to say, and this is a psychoanalytic point, really, that sometimes it's only the things that are forced upon us, as if it is like the only way and the only thing that we know. Sometimes it requires that for us to feel completely bound to something. So what do I mean by this, right? So again, I used the example before of like the way parents raise their children, right? When we are born into this world, there are a lot of choices made for us, right? Our names, we don't get to choose our names for the most part, right? The language we speak, we don't get to choose our language. We don't get to choose like where we go to school, whether we're going to be Jewish or not. What kind of Jewish are we going to be, right? All of these things are fundamentally imposed upon us. And even if we wanted to say no, we can't say no. It's just the way that it is. The things that we are raised with as facts of life, right? That language that we are, raised into speaking, right? The argument would be that is a sense like having the mountain held over your heads at Har Sinai, right? That we are just compelled into a certain form of life that we experience in a very, very deep kind of way. And what Rav Shagar is trying to say here, this is based on the Maharal, is that only because we experience it as a given, as something that is absolute, and as something that is in a sense imposed on us, do we actually come to experience it as something inextricable, as something that is fundamentally, deeply a part of us. And again, there's this illusion to a certain extent that like human beings are born a blank slate, and then our childhood is like the filling up of that blank slate, like a chalkboard, all sorts of things are writing on it. And then there's this illusion that when we're an adult, we can erase the chalkboard and put new things on it. Like we can just erase our childhood and put new things on it. And the answer is that's simply not the case. Right? That the language we are raised into, the way we are raised into the world, has a profound experience shapes our experience of the world in ways that we can't really ever quite escape. But here's the thing. We often don't realize the force of language on us and culture on us until we are in a situation where we realize that it is no longer being forced on us, right? As a child, it's only when you grow up and leave home and all those things that your parents forced on you are now suddenly choices. You might think for yourself, now here's the first time I'm going to be free. But what you also might realize at that very moment, that all those things your parents forced on you, maybe you can't quite escape them. Maybe they're now so deeply embedded in your psyche that you can't experience the world any other way. And this is something that is very important, very profound, because what Purim means in the Rav Shagarian sense here is not the moment where I freely choose, God's not here. I can now, my parents aren't around. Now I can choose whether I'm really going to be a Jew or not. No. What Rav Shagar is saying is that when God's not there, when our parents aren't around, maybe that's the first moment we realize that Judaism isn't actually a choice. That it's just something that is who we are, and we can't escape. And that's the thing about language. The language you are raised in, like it stays with you forever. The words that you learn when you're a child, those words that you use to structure your world, they stay with you in ways that are profoundly real. And the goal for Rav Shagar, as he says here in source 11, he says it's easy to say I'm a Jew because I was born a Jew. And I believe because I was born a believer. However, the because is easily able to deny the objective truth value of my faith, right? On a certain level, we are who we are because that's the way we were born. And what the word because there does a lot of work, because what it does is it reflects the contingency of our existence. I am this because I was born here and to these people in this time in this place, but under other circumstances, it could be very different. Right? If I was born to those parents in that place at that time, my whole life would look different. It's just the way it happened to work out. And again, if you take that contingency seriously, and we should, because it's reality, right? It should make you question a lot of your deeply held beliefs, right? One of the things I always find fascinating is that there are certain Jewish thinkers, Jewish philosophers that are deeply committed to trying to rationally justify their faith, rationally justify their Judaism. And they will go to great lengths to show how everything they believe as a Jew is true, right? And the reason I find that a little bit silly, because it's like, of the billions of people who are born on earth, of the hundreds, if not thousands of religions that are out there, somehow you were just lucky enough to be born into the one that you have proved is absolutely true. Like, who would have thought you were born this way and then you discover it's really the truth? It's like winning the lottery. How lucky you must be, right? Because obviously it's not that simple, right? But the truth is, the world that we are born into, the way we are born into the world, right, defines us whether we like it or not. And even though there's so much contingency involved in that, it was this way, could be another way, Rav Shagar says that, again, the goal that we're trying to reach here, the challenge of covenant is to say, I am a Jew because I was born a Jew. Not due to pangs of conscience and feelings of guilt or bias, rather it comes from a place of brit, of covenant that is personal wholeness and expresses the notion that I am who I am, accepting oneself in the deepest sense of the word. Right? What the Jew realizes on Purim is that, again, like whether God's there or not, like the Torah is the language I grew up in, right? Hebrew, Jewishness is the words that shape my world. And I think what Rav Shagar is trying to point out here is that language so fundamentally structures our experience of the world and ourselves, right? The words that we use are really what make us Jewish. And when we start to realize that, we realize in a sense that, like, our Jewishness, again, without making any kind of ontological claims or genetic claims, right, that our Jewishness is something that is a part of us, whether we like it or not. If you were raised in Jewish words, if you have come to be fluent in Jewish words, then those words shape our experience of the world, and we use them all the time, right? Like I said, shul, tefillah, beit knesset, Shabbos, challah, right? These are words we use all the time, and they fill up the world with a certain set of meanings for us. And to use those words is to experience the world as a Jew. And what it means, I guess, to have faith, to have faith in this context is a sense of loyalty to those words, to feel called by those words, to hear those words being used and to say, wow, there's something there, right? To say those words, right? And feel like even when you're in that hospital room, you're saying Kiddush, you're calling that crappy little roll challah, but it feels like something more than those words is being present in that moment. And there's something, again, Jews have a love affair with words. I love words because, again, it feels like they are part of us, but we also know that they represent something beyond us. Words create worlds, and that's exactly what God did with them, and that's exactly what we do with them as well. That's the way we experience our Jewishness. That's how we maintain faith. Even when it doesn't make sense, we keep speaking the Jewish words. I mean, I'll talk about this a little bit more next week, but even after everything else can get lost, the words remain. When the Jewish people don't have a Beis Hamikdash anymore, when the Jewish people don't have the land of Israel anymore, they still have the words of Torah, right? The words are always there at the end of the day. When our loved ones are no longer here, we still can call their name, right? The words always remain. The words are eternal, in whatever way we can ultimately understand that word. And again, the language of Jewishness that we use, it's not a tool. It doesn't convey knowledge. But rather it's something that becomes a part of us, but also beyond us. We don't get to choose it, but we can learn to accept it. And for Shagar, that's a big part of what it means to have faith. We'll end there, and we will pick up next week with the question of suffering. We got a couple of questions here. I don't know if we still have time, but I'll try my best to look at them real quick. In Hungarian, there's no gender language. Yes. So obviously, gendered languages are going to shape our experience of the world in very specific ways. There's a movement even in Hebrew to try to move away from a genderedness to Hebrew. And again, the very fact that God is gendered as male, creates problems. So yes, the gendered nature of Hebrew language, the Jewish language, is something that we have to grapple with, because it has real ramifications. Again, if we take language as seriously as I'm making, as the claim I'm making here, then we have to take gendered language seriously, because it's not just it's the way we happen to describe God as masculine. No, it's saying something deep about our experience of God and the world. So again, if we take language seriously, then we have to take gendered language seriously. Yes. So I think I mentioned that last week too, Paul, that the breed is through the oral Torah. And because even the non-Jews have the written Torah. That's the point, even that we saw it last week, we saw it this week, right? Once the Torah is translated into Greek, even the non-Jews have the written Torah. What distinguishes the Jews from everybody else, from the Christians, is the oral Torah. But is that spoken language that is the intimacy between God and the Jewish people. We speak to God, right? It is a dialogue with God. That is what the oral Torah reflects. And what's also powerful about the oral Torah, it's not just men studying yeshivot. Everybody, all Jews, young and small, young and old, big and small, men and women, contribute to the language of Torah. It is democratic in that sense. Chaim, you had a question?
Yes. I think of things from a developmental point of view and the development of language. So initially things are inchoate, and then we do use our language, but then we're always interpreting. So, I see from the Asara Mamarot, there's only 9 Mamarot. The 10th Mamar is our interpretation. So we have the Meturgaman, we have Aramaic, we have Yiddish. We have developmentally, a kid doesn't just accept, but they use the language that they have then to reinterpret the world. And yes, it's within a context, but we're constantly translating. I think when we're reading even the words in Hebrew, we're constantly internally translating into language and forming it and shaping it. So there's constant translation.
I hear that. I'm going to push back on you for a moment, though. So I happen to know your son-in-law. He just told me this because I learned with him. And he mentioned to me that you study with Michael Fishbane. So Michael Fishbane is famous for his hermeneutic interpretation of Judaism, right? And what that means is, as you said, and Judaism very nicely fits in within this hermeneutic dynamic that we are constantly interpreting. Hermeneutics is interpretation, that we see language, hear language, experience language. We're always trying to ask ourselves, what does it mean? All language is open to interpretation. That is the essence of Torah itself. But here's the problem with interpretation. Is that it fundamentally operates on a more cognitive level. And the whole claim I want to make here, and I think Rav Shagar is making it as well, is that language doesn't just function on a cognitive level. It cuts deeper than our cognition. So what do I mean by that, right? Isn't language, as you said, we're always interpreting, always trying to understand things. Well, that's not always the case when it comes to language, because language has an effect on us even when we are not interpreting it. So what do I mean? Right, so the classic example, and I'm following here based on Franz Rosenzweig, is that when somebody calls your name, you turn. Right, when somebody calls your name, you have an instinctual, immediate response. You turn to see who is calling you. Right, and what we see in that act, that speech act of somebody calling your name, is that it is not about interpretation. Interpretation maybe comes after, right? You want to start asking, but there's a way in which language acts on us, affects us, that already happens, and maybe even happens at a more deeper level than the act of interpretation itself. Because once somebody calls your name, you turn. It's a very powerful effect on us, the way that language can do that. So the reason I'm trying to highlight that dimension is when we look at language in sort of the cognitive dimension, it sometimes keeps it up here. And what makes language, in the way of Shagar is envisioning it, and the way that I think even the Torah gets at it, is the language isn't just an intellectual act. that is open to interpretation, and how do we understand it, and we want to hold the space open for interpretation, but rather language also cuts down here in a ways that like is pre-subjective and we don't even fully understand, but it grabs hold of us and yanks us, right? Because that's what happens when someone calls our name. And it's that level of language that is getting at this idea of covenants, of the way we are bound to the other who calls our name, because that's what God does. God calls our name, Torah calls our name, in ways that we can't fully escape. And so that's the point I want to just like highlight as another dimension here that really gets at the way language grabs us. And that's why even you say developmentally, cognitively, that's why the languages we are born into have an effect on us that, again, is beyond like the question of hermeneutics, right? Like you hear the song that your mother sang to you when you were a child, even if you don't understand what that song means, it has an effect. It has a pull on you that is profound, right? Language does things to us. And in a certain sense, language is what makes us who we are in the deepest sense of it. And I think that's a lot of what we want to keep in mind in here as well. Any other comments before we finish? All right. So we'll pick up next week with the question of suffering, and that really gets like it, as I said, when everything else has been taken away, what remains? And the hint I'm giving for next week is that the power of Judaism, power of Torah, is that language still remains on some level, even when everything's been taken away. And that says something about what does it mean to begin to grasp with the idea of suffering. Because suffering, again, it just strips everything away. Have a wonderful Shabbat, and we'll pick up next week.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff, and thank you everyone who joined us today. Just to see if we have any announcements. Yeah, looks like no announcement today, so I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Lehitraot.